Slavery is absolute despotism of the most unmitigated form. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote those words, and honestly, they cut right to the core of what we're looking at today. It's so easy to look back at American slavery as just a timeline of dates, or this vague, hazy institution from the distant past. But the reality? It was far more complex and deeply calculating. We are talking about an engineered, heavily entrenched system of absolute control built from the ground up for one primary purpose: profit.
Welcome to This Explainer. I am so glad you're joining us for this one. Today, we have a profound objective. We are going to completely deconstruct the systemic architecture of American slavery. We'll be pulling apart the legal, economic, and ideological pillars that allowed this institution to literally hardwire itself into the nation's founding and then thrive all the way up to the Civil War. Let's get right into it.
To do this, we're going to break things down into 5 interconnected pillars. We'll start with the legal foundation, move into the economic engine, then the second middle passage, the human toll, and finally, ideology and resistance. Tracing these 5 pillars is going to show us exactly how this system sustained itself for nearly a century.
Part 1. The Legal Foundation, Baking Bondage into the Republic's DNA. We have to start with the paradox of a nation founded on Enlightenment liberty that simultaneously hardwired human bondage directly into its founding documents.
Think about the fraction 3/5. There is an immense, haunting power hidden behind that simple number. Back at the 1787 Constitutional Convention, a massive sticking point was how exactly to count enslaved people for political representation. Now remember, legally, enslaved people were treated strictly as property. They had 0 rights, and they certainly couldn't vote. But Southern delegates desperately wanted them counted to boost their own state's political power. The result? The 3/5 compromise. Enslaved individuals would be counted as 3/5 of a person when apportioning congressional representation and electoral college votes. It was a hauntingly calculated move that artificially inflated the political power of slave states for decades, basically ensuring slaveholders dominated the presidency and Congress.
And the framers didn't stop there. They went even further to legally protect the institution. Alongside the 3/5 clause, they locked in a 20-year protection of the international slave trade that literally forbade the federal government from banning the importation of enslaved people until at least 1808. On top of that, they embedded the fugitive slave clause, demanding that enslaved people who escaped into free states be returned to their enslavers. So the big takeaway here is that from day one, slavery was never just a regional quirk. It was constitutionally protected, and it drove national policy.
Part 2. The economic engine, how cotton fueled explosive growth. Because while legal protections are one thing, it was the raw economics that truly drove slavery's massive expansion across the Deep South.
Which actually brings us to a really critical mathematical question. The U.S. did in fact ban the international slave trade in 1808, literally the earliest year the Constitution allowed them to. Yet the enslaved population completely exploded, hitting 4 million by the start of the Civil War in 1860. So how is that mathematically possible if international imports were cut off?
Well, the answer comes down to a single invention: the cotton gin. Invented in 1793, this machine suddenly made short staple cotton wildly profitable to process. The resulting boom is just staggering. By 1820, the nation was pumping out 600,000 bales of cotton. Jumped 1850, that number skyrocketed to 4 million bales. The global demand, especially from industrial Britain and France, was absolutely insatiable. And to meet that kind of demand, the Deep South required a massive, self-sustaining labor force. This very economic explosion is exactly what triggered the horrific domestic mechanisms that took the place of the international trade. Part 3. The second middle passage. The domestic trade and forced migration. With Deep South planters absolutely desperate for labor, a terrifying domestic slave trade was born. Historian Ira Berlin actually defined this as the second middle passage. What it was the forced internal migration and sale of enslaved people from the Upper South, think states like Virginia and Maryland, down into the Deep South. Berlin points out that this massive deportation deeply traumatized Black people, tearing families completely apart and basically reproducing the exact same horrors of the original transatlantic crossing. Just wrap your head around this number: 1 million. An estimated 1 million people were forcibly marched or shipped internally to feed the expanding cotton and sugar frontiers. It grew into the absolute largest enterprise in the South outside the plantations themselves. We're talking regional hubs, massive networks of slave pens, and complex financing just to move human beings. Geographically,
This caused a devastating shift. Up in the Upper South, tobacco was declining and the soil was wearing out, leaving them with a surplus of enslaved labor. They effectively transformed into quote-unquote slave-producing states. Down in the booming Deep South, they became the importers. Their rapidly expanding cotton and sugar economies demanded immense labor, which literally transformed enslaved people into the region's most valuable export commodity.
Part 4. The human toll. The reality of commodification and absolute control. Because we absolutely have to ground these macroeconomics in the horrifying micro-reality of the individuals who actually lived under this absolute control.
To enforce total submission and squeeze out maximum profit, the methods used were absolute and they were brutal. Routine physical violence like whipping, shackling, and branding was the norm. Family separation was rampant. The domestic slave trade meant that any enslaved person could be sold away from their spouse or children at literally a moment's notice. On top of that, there was horrific sexual abuse, and women were heavily exploited to quote-unquote breed more enslaved laborers for that domestic market. And in perhaps the most grim reality of all, there was the commodification of human tissue, where enslaved people were routinely used as non-consenting medical specimens. If you want to understand the dark, calculating logic behind all of this, there's a specific quote referenced by Harriet Beecher Stowe. A Southern judge named Ruffin ruled that the legal treatment of an enslaved person was dictated entirely by, quote, the profit of the master, his security, and the public safety. The physical and psychological torment we just talked about, it wasn't random cruelty. It was a legally sanctioned enforcement mechanism, specifically designed to protect the economic bottom line. Part 5. Ideology and resistance, the collision course to war. How exactly did the nation justify all this, and how did resistance ultimately put the whole country on a collision course to war? Well, to justify it, Southern ideology had to go through a massive radical shift. In the early days, founders like Thomas Jefferson framed slavery as a necessary evil. He compared it to holding a wolf by the ear, basically saying it was dangerous, but letting it go would cause economic collapse. But roll forward a few decades as that cotton economy boomed, and figures like John C. Calhoun and Alexander Stephens totally flipped the script. They started defending slavery as a positive good. They actively claimed it built civilization, and that the subordination of black people was a natural moral condition. They stopped apologizing for the system and instead turned it into the very cornerstone of their culture. But that radicalized ideology slammed right into relentless resistance. Enslaved people constantly fought back. There were organized, terrifying uprisings for the Southern slaveocracy, like Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. Thousands engaged in covert resistance, making daring escapes via the Underground Railroad. And even earlier, tens of thousands defected to British lines during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 just to secure their freedom. At the exact same time, a fierce Northern abolitionist movement was gaining serious traction, led by publishers like William Lloyd Garrison and brilliant formerly enslaved orators like Frederick Douglass, who spent their lives tirelessly exposing the system's hypocrisy to the world. All of this constant resistance caused a rapid escalation nationwide. By 1804, all of the northern states had passed abolition laws, sharply dividing the country. Then the 1831 Nat Turner Rebellion led to violently stricter slave codes down south. By 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, legally forcing Northerners to participate in capturing escaped slaves, which just completely inflamed tensions. By the time Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 on a platform that simply wanted to halt the expansion of slavery into new territories, the southern states, fiercely protective of their wildly profitable system, chose secession, and in 1861, the Civil War began.
And that brings us to the end of our structural breakdown, which leaves us with a really provocative question. How long do the reverberations of a legal, economic, and ideological architecture built on human chattel actually last? As we've seen today, American slavery was never just an unfortunate historical habit. It was a deeply sophisticated, legally protected economic engine that completely shaped the geography and demography of the United States. And when a foundation is poured that deep, its echoes resonate far, far beyond the year it was officially dismantled. I hope this explainer gave you a clearer, more structured understanding of this incredibly complex history. Keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.